with that. Eileen was a heroine for all of us, I think. I've been asked to make a few little notices. First of all, any mobile phones, the usual thing is we please switch them off. Pause when everybody switches off their mobile phone. Oh, all these heads going down. That's wonderful. I've got some messages to read out. First of all, Elizabeth, Eileen's niece, is unfortunately in Cairo and can't be able to not here, but she sends her greetings, that she's with us in spirit, and I must say she donated all the flowers. There are some messages for people not able to attend that have been put on display boards in front of the hall. People feel free to add to those if they've brought writings themselves. Many thanks to all who have written in or emailed the family with condolences. All Eileen's children are here today, of course. The refreshments will be at the end of the ceremony. The ceremony is timed to last about 1 hour and 50 minutes. I'm only in this position up here, I think, because I'm generally known to be bossy, and I think Eileen would highly approve what I got ready, and that is the 1-minute yellow card of the Labour Party, followed by the please stop immediately card, and they will be displayed in front of people if they run over their allocated times. Afterwards, there's tea and buns and whatever outside in the cafeteria, and we have to get out by 6:15. The hall is fitted with an induction loop which should allow people with hearing aids to tune in if they turn their settings to T, whatever that is. If there are any problems, please see Mike Daffern or Alan, the centre manager. Those are all the notices that I've got to give out. I've got 1 or 2 slots myself later on. And I'd like to welcome everybody here today and to say that I don't think you've seen the programme. The programme is divided into 3 sections: family and personal, political and friends. And then a final silent meditation when we conclude. So I'd like to begin by asking Rupert, who's going to read the first bit, an excerpt from Eileen's book, Her Early Childhood.
An extract from Essays on a Life by Eileen Daffern. Eileen and her daughter Jane, Nana, mum to me, discussed her memorial service before she died. Mum has asked me to read a passage from Nana's book about her childhood in Yorkshire. I grew up in a Pennine landscape that was harsh and unyielding, with bleak uplands and vast skyscapes. Far from rebelling against it, I absorbed it and was absorbed by it. It is still part of me. My family name was Clough. Cloughs of that land had, in a sense, been as one for many generations. In the Craven village of Sutton, in the Pennine country of West Yorkshire, where I lived for 18 years, the Clough was a feature, a deep ravine or cleft in the hills, reaching all the way down to the top of the village. The Clough was a magic place for me, my brother.
Something wrong with the mics?
Okay, we'll pick it up a little bit. The Clough was a magic place for me, my brother Jack, and our playmates, our sacred grove. It had a tumbling beck with rocks and pools, noisy with waterfalls. Land rose steeply on each side, covered with beech, ash, sycamore, and oak trees. It was here that we went searching for the first signs of returning spring. Yellow celandines.
Sorry, again, that one apparently is working.
Oh, this one.
Okay. Sorry.
Check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Hello, hello, hello.
What about the one you've got, Bruce? Does that work? Just talk a bit louder.
We've dropped out.
Talk a bit louder.
I can talk louder. Can everyone hear me at the back if I talk a bit louder?
Wonderful.
Yeah? Okay. Yellow celandines, wild garlic, cuckoo pines, and wild currant bushes, pink and tangy. Later on, there were carpets of bluebells, red campion, and white stitchwort. In summer, we caught tadpoles in the beck and jam jars, carrying them home carefully by the string tied around the neck. Sometimes we followed the beck down to the top of the village, where it formed deep trout pools before flowing away, dark and mysterious, through the private ground of the hall, an ornate square Victorian mansion belonging to a local mill owner. Further on, it issued again from a tunnel to flow down into the mill dam. Here, in the hard winter frosts, we used to skate after school. One memorable year, we skated blissfully for 6 whole weeks, night after night after we had had our tea, avoiding the corner where we were hissed at by mill dam swans, angry at being deprived of their I have memories too of rare hot days spent lying in the soft grasses, listening to harebells tinkling faintly in the light breeze and a hum of bees working in heather and gorse. In our teens, my cousin Anne and I used to picnic on the edge of the moors, drinking tea from a working man's enamel can and eating raspberry jam sandwiches. Below us stretched out a panorama of the Aire Valley. We could follow the course of the river to where mill chimneys rose up from villages dotted here and there. A ribbon of road wound along the valley to Kildwick with its long church, with long kirk of Craven, then onto the market town of Skipton and the Yorkshire Dales beyond. And always, everywhere we looked, a backdrop of the moors. To me as a child growing up, the village was far from ordinary. It was a magic place, worthy of celebration, with quirky folk and its own seasonal ritual. It was also a safe place of security and stability. When I went down to the village on errands, I seemed to know everyone. They knew me. I played in the streets and in the park. I wandered in the fields near home and along the beckside. And from the age of 7.5, every morning, walked a mile to and from the local train station to go to school. Most of the way, I was quite alone. When I first started this trek, the local postman rebuked my mother for being hard-hearted, so she told me years later. Yet all the time I was growing up, I never remember encountering anything untoward or being frightened by anyone. In my teens, I experienced the hills as an escape from the confinement of home. Nature was my temple, and this was where I worshipped, not the chapel where I went to every Sunday. Out of a strong sense of identity, with the land has come a need for independence and freedom, for space and solitude. At difficult times in my life, it has given me endurance, if not the fortitude I aspired to in my early teens. I measured myself up to nature, both as a refuge and as a challenge, because it endures, unchanging. I live now in Brighton, where the bare Sussex Downs stretch for miles behind the town, a kind of continuation of the landscape of my early childhood. They give me the same sense of the endless space of earth and sky. So does the view from my workroom, as I look down a tree-lined street to a wide patch of sea stretching far out to the horizon. The constant movements of the waves, the shifting patterns of light, reflections of sky, and cloud on the water present me with a Turner, a Monet, or when the sea is rough, a Winslow Homer. An immense panorama of sky on days when great clouds pile up on top of one another, cased along by the strong prevailing southwest winds, has some affinity with those seemingly boundless landscapes of my childhood. I've always been conscious of my own good fortune, and the older I get, the more I appreciate and value what I have. My Aunt Annie used to tell and retell a story which has stayed with me all of my life. A little boy living high up in a remote valley used to look longingly each morning over to the hills on the other side where he could see a house which had golden windows sparkling in the sunshine. The house was constantly in his mind. It haunted him. One day he decided he had to go off in search of this wonderful treasure trove, so different from his own rather poor grey dwelling. So he set off very early one misty morning. He walked all day, down into the valley, along hot, dusty roads, and finally, towards the end of the day, made the long climb up to where he thought the house must be. But to his utter disappointment, there was just a dull, grey house with ordinary windows and no sign of gold anywhere. Tired and disappointed, he sat down and looked back across the valley where he had come from, towards the hills where he lived. And there, astonished, he saw his own house, and every window was gleaming in gold.
Thank you, Rupert, very much indeed. I'm now going to ask Mike, who's done some sort of photograph projection of Eileen's history, to come and deliver his section.
Thank you, Bruce. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be a whistle-stop tour through Eileen's life. So bear with me, and please remember, friends, that if your image doesn't appear, that's my mistake, not Eileen's. You were obviously part of her life and in her heart. So Eileen was born on the 1st of January in 1914 to Herbert and Martha Clough. She grew up in the Dales village of Sutton in Craven of the Pennine country of West Yorkshire. The Clough that you've heard about from Rupert is the name of the steep cleft or cliff in the hills which broadens at its base to accommodate the village. Her father was a wool buyer, as was his father for the local mill. The Clough family were numerous in the area. Eileen's branch were mainly Baptists. Her mother's family were Inghamites. Early influences were village life, relatives, strong local personalities, the local economy and its hierarchies, church-going and Sunday school, the landscape and the local towns. She had a really very lively and healthy childhood. In 1923, aged 11, she went to Skipton Girls' High School, where she was very largely happy in spite of the authoritarian and disciplined environment. Education focused on the arts, which was traditional for girls at that time. She was impressed by the teachers who became lifelong role models of elegance and learning. In 1932, having won a scholarship, she went to London University to major in French at Bedford College. While shy and overawed by the sophisticated South, but finding university life on the whole not challenging enough, Eileen sought refuge in hard work, religion, music, and theatre going, often with her father, who regularly came down to London to buy wool. As part of her course, she went to live for spells in France, and it is here that she truly found her independence, and was first infused with social idealism, liberté, equalité, et fraternité. She took France and its culture to her heart. In 1936, aged 22, she decided against training to be a teacher, one of the few career options open to women in that age, and went instead on a graduate secretariat course which she saw as a passport to travel. She teamed up with Peggy Curran, a university friend, to travel through Australia, and then went on alone through New Zealand and South Africa. She worked in a variety of jobs, including secretariat and shop work, being a governess on a sheep farm, and teaching in both Australia and New Zealand. Her eyes were open to the working conditions of women, and although generally hedonistic in pursuit of travel, she became increasingly political aware and socially critical. Given the choice by her South African uncle of either staying for the duration or leaving, she returned to Great Britain 3 weeks before the outbreak of the Second World War. After training in personal management, Eileen worked for some of the largest companies in the UK, the state-owned munitions industry, ICI, and the Metal Box Company. Starting on the factory floor, Eileen eventually became involved with top policy formation at HQ level. The war politicised her and led to a growing involvement in radical policies. She joined the Communist Party in 1941. She was particularly concerned with women's rights and the improvement of working conditions generally. She campaigned for all of the issues of the day, including the opening of the Second Front. As for so many others, the dropping of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs on largely civilian populations, in her words, changed everything and led to her joining the nascent anti-nuclear protest movement. From that time on, peace issues occupied the top of her political agenda. During the war, she lived with her best friend Libby in Hampstead, where Libby met and eventually married Eileen's dashing brother, Jack Clough. Eileen met George Daffern, her future husband, while both worked as personnel managers for Metal Box. The end of the war meant the end of Eileen's job, and she was given her P45 along with other female managers and replaced with men. With her redundancy money, she set off with George to study industrial relations and productivity in America, in advance of the thousands of productivity missions funded by the Marshall Plan to bring managers, technicians and trade unions to study the American way of business. Armed with good introductions and references and living on casual jobs and earnings from published articles, Eileen and George toured the United States, returning to the UK in 1949 to get married and for the birth of their children, first Jane and then Michael. They decided to emigrate to the New World in 1950. Eileen was 36 and her mother came out with her to help get the family settled. Eileen and George prospered in Canada. George climbed the ladder in personal management with the Canadian National Railways, and Eileen helped in the background, reading and editing his work. She made home and looked after the young children, with Thomas born in 1956. She developed a wide circle of good friends amongst the left-leaning professionals of Westmount, and with them continued to campaign for nuclear disarmament, focusing particularly on the comprehensive test ban. She also participated in pioneering citizen forum discussions, live CBC radio discussions on topical issues broadcast countrywide. The Canadian years with her young family and husband were some of the happiest of Eileen's life. In 1960, sad to say goodbye to her friends, the family left Canada to return to England, choosing to live in Brighton because of its proximity to London, to the sea, and for the quality of its light. Eileen actively supported her husband as he established himself as a management consultant, making available his North American experience for UK companies, a lucrative role for a few years which enabled their purchase of 187 Eastern Road, a four-storey late Victorian terraced house with a long garden and a sea view, which remained Eileen's much-loved home until her end. Eileen made contact with the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, demonstrating annually outside the Brighton venues of the TUC and the political parties' conferences, and helping to organise fringe meetings, protest demonstrations, writing leaflets, etc. A pattern of activity which continued well into her 90s. She also reconnected to France through annual holidays to Paris and the South. The years 1964 and 1974 were marked by the illness and the long decline and eventual death of George from Alzheimer's. These were the darkest days of Eileen's life. She was split three ways. Firstly, she had to become the principal breadwinner, getting a job working full-time as a French teacher at West Lane Grammar School. Secondly, as a mother trying to help her children to develop. And thirdly, as a carer for her increasingly sick husband. Of the three roles, she had most overt success in teaching, particularly participating in the move over to comprehensive education in 1972, when West Lane and Stanmer Secondary Modern merged to become Falmer Comprehensive. In 1 year, she took pride in all of her 35-year O-level students passing. Her headmaster and the head of department, recognising her qualities, gave her sixth form work of increasing scope. She thrived in the 60s atmosphere of intense educational experimentation in interdisciplinary pupil-centred learning and new methods of language teaching. Part of this was a strong relationship with local Sussex University and its language lab, as well as curriculum development projects for the school's council. With the support and encouragement of Peggy D. Freeman, she developed a course on contemporary Europe, its political, economic and social aspects, and then followed this with a course on contemporary European literature. These were published and disseminated nationally by the university. In 1971, her daughter Jane married Tim, and this was followed a year later by the birth of Jane's first child, Daniel, Eileen's first grandchild. Eileen's curriculum development work led to a gradual shift of work from school to university, where she became increasingly active in the school's unit, attached to the Graduate Centre for Contemporary European Studies. Through conferences, publications and fellowships, support was given by the unit to teachers of contemporary European studies and languages all over Britain. Her professional working life ended in 1984 at the age of 70, when she retired as head of the unit, without an occupational pension, since much of her working life had been part-time, including in latter years for the university. She was replaced by a man on full-time and higher pay. Within 5 years, the unit had been closed. Family life was increasingly focused on being a grandmother during this decade, with Rupert, Jane's second child, being born in 1976. In 1982, Mike and Vicky's son Ivan was born. In 1985, Thomas and Sue's first child, Helen, was born, followed by Sophia in 1986. In this decade, for the first time in 25 years, Eileen was living without other members of her family in the same house, but not entirely alone, since she often had very good neighbours. She also had the company of lodgers in the basement and top flat, many of whom became firm friends. In the late 70s, she met and welcomed Michael Brown into her life, a positive relationship which did much to heal the deep wounds of her final years with her dying husband. A university reader and course director, Michael came to live with Eileen for the following 8 years, and during that time they enjoyed being together with their respective families and taking holidays in Europe, particularly France, in the Ardèche and Provence. This decade also saw a revival of Eileen's peace campaign work. During the 60s and the early 70s, Eileen had been chair of Southeast Region CND. Following the 78 US Declaration of Intent to Cite New Generation Cruise and Pershing nuclear weapons in Europe, the peace movement mobilized rapidly, with a huge influx of people concerned to counter the threat of nuclear war in Europe. Throughout the early and mid-80s, as the Secretary of the Sussex Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament, she worked hard to foster a broad coalition of peace activist groups in Sussex. Through this regional umbrella grouping, many events and actions were organised, including anti-cruise and trident protest marches, canvassing support for the United Nations Special Sessions on Disarmament, campaigning for the declaration of nuclear-free zones in local councils, Brighton and Crawley so declared in '81, and supporting the protest occupation at Greenham Common, and many other similar occupations such as at Molesworth. In 1981, she was elected a member of CND's National Council and then co-opted onto its International Committee, where she remained for much of the following decade. Eileen moved on, developing campaigning links with the French Mouvement de la Paix, and specifically between Brighton and the Dieppe peace groups. In 1998, this work was acknowledged when she was made an honorary citizen of Dieppe. She also fostered links between peoples of East and West to counter the widespread media propaganda of these people being enemies, primarily in a series of exchanges with representatives of the official peace committees of Eastern Europe, as in 1980 visiting with the Leningrad Peace Committee. After retirement from paid work in '84, Eileen committed herself to full-time national and local and international peace campaigning. Representing SAND or CND, she attended events and conferences organised by the European Nuclear Disarmament End or the International Peace Bureau. In Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, Finland, Estonia, Greece and Geneva. Exchange visits with East European peace committees included trips to Poland, East Germany and Hungary. There are 2 Bibles throughout, with the United Nations Charter and the final act of the Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Eileen considers Gorbachev's leadership pivotal in diffusing the mounting tensions between East and West, and through his Reykjavik summit with Reagan, preparing the ground for the subsequent Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of '87, which finally saw the removal of the nuclear-armed Pershing and cruise missiles from Europe. 1988 saw Eileen become involved in a peace study and a broad-based committee to examine whether an Institute of Peace Studies could be established at the University of London. Her youngest son, Thomas, worked for this committee in '89-90 and later founded the Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy, which remains active to this day. The first Gulf War in '91 saw Eileen joining the Brighton Committee Against War in the Gulf and conducting radio interviews and speaking at rallies against the war. In her opinion, the UN process was being bypassed to attempt to establish a new world order, Bush '91, based not on collective security, but on domination by the USA and its close allies. In 1995, at the age of 81, Eileen resigned as Secretary of SAND, passing the baton to George Fairbrother, who continues in that role today. In 2000, reiterating its broad-based approach, SAND's name changed to the Sussex Peace Alliance. Eileen continued to have an active old age, with widespread interest in continuing travels. Torn by the split in the Communist Party in the early 90s, she eventually sided with the reorganised Democratic Left until in 1998 this too disintegrated. Also in '95, her 6th grandchild, Shanti, was born to Thomas and I. Her primary creative effort went into writing her book, a coherent odyssey of 10 essays representing the major themes of her life. Published in 2007 by City Press, the book launch was a joyous affair. She was also much pleased when it was reviewed by no less a personage than Jeremy Paxman and published in The Guardian. She was also interviewed about her life in Woman's Hour. The best review, as with her recent obituaries, was published in the Morning Star, and we have copies of their obituary along with copies of her book available at the back of the hall. The events of 9/11 and the subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and later Iraq filled Eileen with dread, although she refused to be pessimistic. The main causes of war are economic, even if religion and ethnicity are often drawn in, she wrote. An internationalist all her life, she rejected the current form of globalism as little more than US-backed financial imperialism, and took heart in the growing number of people, particularly the young, that were actively opposing and demonstrating against it. A world where the richest 1/5 of the world's people receive 82% of the world's total income is unacceptable and will lead to conflict, she believed. Her last campaigning act in August of this year, while recovering from a stroke, was to write a published letter to The Guardian reminding people of the existence and the post-war intent of the UN's Economic and Social Committee to be a global system of economic cooperation in contrast to the current economic turmoil based on national competition and speculator greed. In her final years of old age, well supported by community and family, and living in her own house with a clear mind, Eileen's attentions were increasingly focused on the minute details of staying alive. In this she was impressive, often phoning the pharmacy to query the omission or a change of a particular medicine. She suffered from a threatening heart condition which saw her admitted to hospital after a final trip to her favourite holiday destination of Paliahora in Crete, to which she had returned to again and again. Continually visited by friends and people whose lives she had touched, she continued to inspire affection and act as a role model. Festivals and occasions which brought her family together were a source of delight, as were the parties that continued to be held in her garden. She died as comfortably as possible in hospital for pneumonia after celebrating a final Christmas with her family. The look on her face just after her death reflected character and a determination to do what she could to make the world a better place. She lived her life with intelligence, energy and love. And I think that individually and together, she certainly had a positive effect on her times, together with her fellow workers and friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was absolutely wonderful. Very moving. I'd like to ask Dan now to come up and say his few words. Where is Dan now? There we are. I don't know which microphone's working now, Dan. Just try out.
As her eldest grandchild, I'd like to talk about Eileen the Granny. It's a role she played to 6, maybe 8 of us, to me and my brother Rupert, Ivan, Helen and Sophie, and Shanty Grace. And Abby and Grail also experienced her grannying firsthand as well. As with everything in her life, she was a dedicated and tireless granny. And my cousins have told me they remember her bringing a bit of European elan to their childhood, cooking French tarragon chicken, conveying a love of art of everything French, and having excellent taste in Chilean protest posters. But guys, you got off so easy. As the first, Rupert and I were the guinea pigs for all that loving grannying. Her 28th successful career for those counting today. Nana was lucky enough, thanks to our extremely progressive familial arrangement, to be able to look after us for at least half of all the school holidays. And for us it was like, well, did anyone see that programme, The 1940s House, about recreating life in the 1940s? Well, Nana's was just like the 1890s house in Yorkshire. There were the Baptist temperance certificates on the wall, the lack of heating, the stewed prunes, the charades of Christmas, and the workhouse conditions. We washed up in cold water, swept the floor with her brooms, not those newfangled vacuums, and sweated on pushing her extremely manual lawnmower. What really made it the 1890s, though, was Eileen's profound denial of a key 20th century invention: television. As all children instinctively know, television isn't a treat, it's like air, requiring constant consumption no matter how bad, and even during sleep. But Eileen managed to deny the existence of television even while she was watching it. Because she never watched telly, she watched Newsnight. And to her, Jeremy Paxman just magically appeared next to her. Which, to be fair, sometimes she really did. But not even Newsnight was allowed during suppers with me and Rupert. This was heresy to the young Rupert and I. Talk over dinner, what? And with an old woman, oh, you see, she could have let us sit there for 2 weeks vegging in front of her tiny goldfish bowl, barely colour, steam-powered TV. But being Eileen, she chose the difficult path and stuck with it. Our complaints of boredom were brutally crushed with the 1890s Yorkshire fact: only boring people get bored. It was the classic Eileen bacon switch, and suddenly we were guilty in silence. But it did force us to get creative, mainly with our ongoing inter-sibling guerrilla war. But to be fair, when not allowing us to not be bored, she did take us on trips. Walks, really, with her friends. Thousands of friends, in fact, who'd all sing songs, nice, easy ones for kids, like Maggie, Maggie, Maggie. And as Eileen was old, she made us carry her stuff. Mostly a big brown sign with the letters S-A-N-D in huge letters. Why we were protesting against beaches, we didn't work out for years. But as beaches were fun, we figured they must also be right-wing and therefore verboten, like white bread and Coca-Cola. Yes, things were serious with Nana. But if we did satisfy her stringent standards for washing up, mowing, intelligent conversation, we might get to occasionally glimpse the telly. With her 1890s Yorkshire commentary, of course. Her verdict on Knight Rider: a talking car. Stupid. On Knight Rider's turbo boost: a flying car. Ha! Stupid. On the littlest hobo: a clever dog. Ha! Stupid. On Spider-Man: well, you get the picture. She was also, arguably, whisper it, not the most sensitive of souls. Sometimes. Back when higher education was free, I applied for both kinds, universities and polytechnics, and was immediately rejected by every single poly. When I called my beloved Nan for some touching, consoling words, she said, well, Abby has just been accepted to Oxford. Thanks, Nana. But while she never offered easy consolation, we always knew we were loved. In a tough Yorkshire, I used to get up before dawn and walk 5 miles to school in the snow without breakfast time away, but deeply and profoundly loved nonetheless. She never gave us the easy, oh, that's nice, dear. But instead she engaged, she questioned, she demanded the best, and ultimately, she always supported our most difficult endeavours. She was serious, but she also took us seriously, and that's about the most powerful thing you can do to a young person. And as we grew out of the Dickensian fear phase, the years of, can I have some more stewed prunes, please? We realised few could boast a granny who wore glamorous scarves, maintained a religious, if measured, commitment to red wine, threw huge garden parties, knocked about with a toy boy, and hung out at an American Air Force base with all her girlfriends. So I'm sure I'm not the only one of us to have quite literally died out on tales of our granny. In fact, I think tales of her exploits have helped me pull at least once, so thanks for that. I guess it makes up for the Abbey getting into Oxford. Almost. But her commitment to peace, feminism, equal rights and socialism was no laughing matter, especially for her. Her generation fought a war and then fought for a better life. and she refused to allow that to be ridiculed. But I confessed for a while that my admiration was tinged with confusion. What was the point of banging on about nuclear bombs? What could she do? Didn't she realise it was like so overt? But she was right to take it seriously and to keep campaigning. For all our wit and sarcasm, our have I got news for you and our mock the weeds, for all our freedom to Facebook, it's our generation that watches in paralysed amazement as the social democratic rights she fought for were dismantled piece by piece. The Sussex Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament hasn't brought about the end of nuclear weapons, but Sam's existence and Eileen's deep commitment was a constant reminder that there are limits to what people will accept, and they help keep open the space for political opposition, dissent, and social democracy. I'd love to be able to say, it's okay now, the grandkids have got it from here. But I can't honestly say that. But if I can't honestly say that, it's certainly not because she left us short of inspiration. So instead, let's just say, so long, Nana, and thanks for all the stewed prunes. Like many of the things you gave us, we may not have appreciated them at the time, but now we know how good they were for us.
Well worth the extra 3 minutes. Excellent. I'd like to ask Helen now to speak briefly to us. She's going to introduce us tonight.
I will be very short. I haven't got a lot to say. I was just really pleased and proud to be part of this family.
Use this microphone. This side.
Hello. Yeah, I was really glad to know Eileen and to see her most weekends. We had a lot of time to talk. She helped me through some hard times. She was a very wise, devoted grandmother, and I will miss her.
We have Sophia now. It's also going to say a word.
Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. I am 1,000 winds that blow. I am the diamond glints on snow. I am the sunlight on ripened grain. I am the gentle autumn rain. When you awaken in the morning's hush, I am the swift uplifting rush of quiet birds in circled flight. I am the soft stars that shine at night. Do not stand in my grave and cry. I am not there. I did not die.
Grandchildren, Shanti, I think you've got to say something.
This is a poem by Andrew Mission. The voices live which are the voices lost. We hear them and we answer, or we try. But words are nervous when we leave them lost, and chatter, stop, or dully slide away. So everything they mean to summon up is always just too far, just out of reach, unless our memories give time to and learn the lesson about how wisdom teach. Of how in brief we find a way to keep the dead beside us as time goes on, invisible and silent, but the deep foundation of ourselves, our cornerstone, and that's a prayer from our Siddur, the Jewish prayer. We live our life and hardly know its nature, but from a mystery we come, to a mystery we go. The death of those close to our hearts cools and humbles us. It reminds us that we must all die, like grass that grows in the morning, that grows so fractured and heaviness, and then the evening fades and dies, till the end our years set aside. How can we face the reality of that? By remembering the goodness of our loved ones and shaping our lives after their example. For their memory is truly a blessing and an inspiration for all our days. May our lives always be worthy of their memory.
That was a very lovely trio or quartet altogether. I'd like now to ask Thomas, Eileen's youngest son, who you've seen a picture of him as the young Thomas and the baby Thomas and now the grown-up Thomas, is going to speak to us too about his father.
Helen, could you... Greetings, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I've been asked to read a passage from St. Paul. We're meeting in a Christian church. Eileen was, in spite of all her soul-searching and spiritual and philosophical and intellectual questing, she remained someone who believed Christianity should be actualized in social and political and peace activism. But at her heart, she remained a woman of faith. And I'm going to therefore read the passage she asked me to read out, which is one of the most profound of all the New Testament passages. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, but I deliver my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrong, but rejoices in the right. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For our knowledge is imperfect, and our prophecy is imperfect. But when the perfect comes, the imperfect will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now, we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall understand fully, even as I have been fully understood. So faith, hope, love, abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love. Now those wonderful words are written nearly 2,000 years ago, as you will probably all know, by St. Paul. Here we are 2,000 years later. That was the kind of hope those early Christians had of a reformed and transformed world through the power of love. I would say my mother was one of the many millions and myriads of people since then who've done their best to make that dream come true, that vision. And I want to say a few brief words about her contribution. Eileen was above all an educator. We saw from Mike's wonderful survey of her life. She was dedicated to learning, to studying as a child. She used to walk 7 miles to get to school. She won a scholarship. She went to the University of London and then in turn became a teacher. I would say she was a lifelong educator, primarily. And I remember having to book appointments with her as a young boy because she was so busy marking homework. She took her work as a teacher very, very seriously. And so I think that's the first thing I want to just thank her for giving us all, is a knowledge of the importance of education. All her grandchildren have gone on to university and one is still in the pipeline on that. And thank you, Eileen. The next thing I want to say about her legacy is that she was a great lover of the arts, and firstly, literature. I remember Eileen's library as a boy was full of poetry. I remember discovering Rilke and Wallace Stevens and Zbigniew Herbert, a Polish poet, and just falling in love with poetry through Eileen. I have memories as a 6-year-old, her encouraging me to write my first poem around a Christmas tree. And it filled me with a passion when she sent me to Paris on student exchanges as a teenager to become a poet. That was my first ambition in life, and it remains very dear to me. And I know that Mum loved literature and novels. She read Proust, I don't know, 10 times in French. She brought us up on a diet of Tolstoy and the great Russian novelists, Dickens, etc. Also drama, taking us to plays in Brighton, and music. continuously taking us to the Philharmonic Orchestra here in Brighton. So a great lover of classical music, teaching us all the piano. And finally, visual art. Mum was a great lover and connoisseur of painting. She took us to the Picasso Museum in Collioure in France. So I would say she was a passionate lover of the muses, and her love of landscape that comes through her writing. When she took me once to Greece, her love of Greece was an aesthetic delight in the light and landscapes of Greece. The next thing I want to say about Eileen is her love of languages. That was her professional career as a teacher. And she brought me up to have a deep delight in English. Her knowledge of English literature was very profound, along with my father. We used to read Shakespeare on Sunday afternoons. But also she'd studied Anglo-Saxon at university. She was someone that knew about the history of English, and also Latin. And for a time she was a Latin teacher and brought us up to have a respect for Latin. And in fact, on her deathbed, I was having some conversations with her using Latin and French, discussing some spiritual matters, that they sound better in Latin and French. And she squeezed my hand. And that led to her a great love of European studies, European literature, French literature, and as Mike said, a great Francophile. But also Italy, Spain, you know, the whole project, Eastern Europe, the Balkans. I think she was a great lover of the European ideal, not of the EU as it's become. The next thing I want to say is Eileen's work as an academic, which was hinted at the University of Sussex. And she became involved in a committee that was mentioned at the University of London to set up an Institute of Peace Studies, which I then got involved with as their research development officer. And I worked for about 6 years based at the Institute of Education. Eileen and I kept in close contact during that time. And my mission was to actualise the dream that academics around the world could take their responsibilities seriously. It led me to speak twice at the United Nations on the role of universities in advancing peace. It led me to a conference at the Vatican talking with religious leaders on their duties as educators and role models, and eventually to set up the International Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. Eileen hosted a conference of philosophers in 187 when Soviet and American philosophers met. Really for the first time, I was then coordinating International Philosophers for Peace following a meeting in Moscow. And Eileen had known a book by a man called John Somerville, an American philosopher, who'd been a witness at the, basically the anti-communist witch hunts in the States. He'd been an expert on Marxist thought as a philosophical exponent. And he'd been a fair witness and got some of these people off their prosecutions. And I met him in '88 here in Brighton, University of Sussex, at a conference of international philosophers. And Eileen supported all that and really assisted from behind the scenes with the networking. Einstein had written a foreword to Somerville's book, and I know that in setting up the Pugwash Association of Scientists Campaigning for Peace, Eileen's influence at the University of London was profound. She had a sort of network of academic colleagues, which then she introduced me to. Maurice Wilkins, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, co-discoverer of DNA, was one of the committee that appointed me to direct this project. And the vision was that the sciences, the humanities, the arts, that the social sciences, that the academics at the highest levels of this planet should coordinate and cooperate together and work for the intelligence bit of this quote. With intelligence we can change the world. That's the rational application of our intellect, folks. And that's the legacy that I'm bequeathed. And I want to say finally, you know, the philosophical understanding of Eileen was profound. We had many, many long discussions. She loved the notion of the dialectical spiral, as you probably know. And strangely enough, the spiral comes up in all the great philosophical systems of the world, in Christianity and Druidry and so on. There's this notion that things return at a higher level. As she was dying, she was saying to me, this is not goodbye, this is just au revoir, to